hold my own here. So it took sea lamprey to get the countries together. It took federal intervention, or the threat of federal intervention, to get the states and provinces together. It took court decisions to get the tribes formally in the game. Process-wise, we have some warts. Thank you, Mr. Hansen, Dr. Hansen. But generally, our commitment to the science part of it is not to be questioned. It's not to be challenged. What is to be challenged is the commitment to participate and continue that participation. So I'm here to talk to you about why I think the plan works, and I think those are all valid concerns, and I hope I did a good job of synthesizing. That wasn't intended to be funny at all. So I'm going to talk to you from my experience as a 30-year employee formerly with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Division of Wildlife. I spent my whole career, 30 years, on Lake Erie. I was a field biologist for a third of it and participated on the task groups. I was a supervisor of a research station for a third of it and sat on the standing technical committee. And I was a program administrator for a third of it and sat on the Lake Erie Committee and in the Council of Lake Committees. So it's from that perspective that I want to talk to you about the things we do well for making this plan work, because I think you want to make sure you're reinforcing and understanding and doing the things you do well to address the next round of challenges. The plan's over 30 years old. It's withstood the test of time, in my view. So we want to make sure we're doing the right things moving forward. Disclaimer, my perspective only, not that of Ohio DNR or the Fishery Commission or anyone else. The other resident old farts in the room can give you their perspectives, preferably over a beer. So I think one of the things that makes it really work is that there's a lot of unique features about the Great Lakes. The sheer size, 245,000 square kilometers. I think it's the largest surface freshwater system in the world. I've heard a lot about the diffuse management authorities across the states, the province of Ontario, 3 tribal groups, lots of different stakeholders, charter boat fisheries, tribal fisheries, recreational fisheries, commercial fisheries, and within each one of those, there are subsets that have different interests and objectives. Huge binational and federal presence in the lakes. Of course, there's the Fishery Commission. You also have the International Joint Commission, the Great Lakes Commission. You've got 4 federal signatories to the agreement, and you've got other federal agencies that are not signatory, that are having huge roles in terms of what's going on in the ecosystem. We've got managed stocks similar to the marine resources, dissimilar to some of most inland resources, where you have a single population in a lake. Here we have, in most lakes, defined stocks that can mix. That's part of the challenge. And then lastly, we're the poster child, unfortunately, for established AIS, not just introduced ones, but established. And look at the common carp, it goes back over 100 years, right? So it's part of the game. Some of them are predators, not parasites like they should be. But the message here is that the plan brings all of these in some capacity or another. It also talks about the fishery issues, so you've heard some of those from Dr. Hansen, and these are brought on by the fact we've got a lot of people from both countries that live around the lakes. You can go to the GLEAM website and see an index of stress. Not surprisingly, it matches up where you have the people. And where we have a lot of people, me being one of them that still lives in the Great Lakes Basin, we have impacts on environmental quality that affect fish community stability, results in lost fishing opportunities, access to the resource, and when resources get limited, you have increasing likelihood of conflict and competition among the users. And of course, it identifies this other issue of emerging climate change. My point of view is that the first version in 81 was revised in 97. It's adapted, it's time tested. We have buy-in from the 8 states, the DNRs, or the equivalent names for those, MNR, DFO, 3 tribal groups, 3 federal US groups, to the common goal, commitment to and buy-in to the common goal, which I'm not going to read either, but I think the important part is we're focusing on secure fish communities with sustaining stocks, self-sustaining natural stocks with hatchery plantings, providing benefits to a suite of users and contributing to a healthy ecosystem. So you go back to basic fisheries management, fish, people, habitat, it's all there. And again, it's kind of the fuzziness to allow all this non-binding commitment to occur, and the 4 strategies that Dr. Hansen spoke of. I'm going to give you a little different angle on some of these. When I was a greenhorn and went to my first task group meeting back in the early 80s, I thought it was remarkable when it came time for whatever group it was. I think it was a standing technical committee on a recommended allowable harvest on walleye, and they bantered about where everybody wanted to land, and finally it was put to just a decision. Does anybody oppose? Anybody oppose this value? And I remember thinking, well, they don't vote. They don't ask, all right, who's in favor, who's opposed. They just say, is anybody opposed? No one raises their hand, it's done. And it's like, well, they just said they can live with it. That's how I always viewed consensus. They just told me they can live with this. We accept it, and we live with it, and we move forward. The flip side of that is, though, that everybody has veto power. And if you can't live with it, you say no, it's a done deal, it's not happening. So that is the other part of this that makes it at times challenging, the herding the cat syndrome. With that comes this notion of being accountable. So in a non-binding agreement, if you walk away, you didn't voice any opposition, so now you're accountable for carrying through your part to what you all just agreed to by not opposing it. And that couples with, in my view, this notion of sharing information. And I found that regardless of what group you were in, when the working relationships were strong enough that the cards went from here to there, we made progress. It was a lot easier to say, I'm happy to work with you if I know what it is you want to do. This was particularly relevant at the lake committee level. But when I got kept here, it was really hard to work towards something meaningful. And that may be in part why you have struggles to get consensus on some aspects of this. And lastly, the ecosystem management strategy is the linkage to the environmental quality groups that are not signatory to our agreement. So you've heard about the structure, and I think the big point here is that it is a facilitated structure. The lake committees are the arms and legs, separated. In practice, they should be separated from the science. We have a Council of Lake Committees group. If you're a lake committee member, you are by default on the Council of Lake Committees. And I feel and have felt this group should be extremely powerful, more than it has been. Still feel that way. There are connections to the Enforcement Committee. There are connections to a Fish Health Committee. And we have a group that makes sure the plan stays relevant. So it's all there, and you have a Fishery Commission to facilitate it. I think the last part that makes this work for me is the networking and the relationships. So, by signing the agreement, you have the federal signatories and the non-federal signatories sort of linked at the hip. Fishery Commission is not signatory, but it has the facilitation role to go along with its mandate to control lampreys and coordinate science. So it's certainly part of this inner core, this core relationship. And I would also assert that the stakeholders are now a firm part of this inner core as well, through the advisors and through the interactions, obviously, with the managers. And you probably could extend the circle into the federal signatories as well. But I consider that to be the inner core that needs to be preserved for moving forward, for keeping this plan relevant. But there is this sphere of influence that extends out to the other commissions, the other non-signatory federal agencies, universities. I will make a disclaimer here. I think there are the PERM scientists and those that are working very closely with sea lamprey control and the other signatory agencies are certainly more in the core than out on the periphery. NGOs, legislators, media are all contacts that I appreciated when I was with Ohio DNR, that somebody was making contacts and could provide us some information. At the CLC level, you get legislative updates from Mark Gaden almost every time you meet. I think those are helpful. You don't need to read them all the time, but somebody's keeping contact on things. That's really important. The challenge for the commission, and actually for everybody here, is how do you balance that against your core responsibilities, because it takes resources, a lot of resources. Talk a little bit about the relationships between the commission, the lake committees, the managers here, and the stakeholders. And I view the services provided by the commission as getting the lake committee products, state of lake reports, FCOs, environmental objectives, other types of reports out there. They're not easy to do, we've heard that, but it's nice to have someone reminding folks that we've got to get these out. And it's nice that the lake committees feel empowered to go back the other way and say, we don't want to follow necessarily that particular format or that. We control the messaging, basically. There is that two-way that goes on. In my career, there were two issues of conflict. One involved yellow perch in the early 90s. I was still a biologist at the time, wasn't engaged in that one. And there wasn't a conflict resolution component to the JSP, which came about in 97. There was another one in 2004 involving walleye that I was right in the middle of. And in both times, the commission played a pivotal role in bringing the groups together to move forward. And it wasn't easy. In fact, I would even say from the 04 experience that it wasn't so much the formal arbitration process that was invoked that got us back together. What it did is I think it just got everybody to a point over dinner where we just said, this is silly, enough's enough, let's figure this out and move forward. And I would argue that our relationship got better, actually, after that experience. The other component, sea lamprey control, obviously vitally important, understanding what the managers want and the objectives, the targets, but also the other invasive animals. I think the binational risk assessment models that are in place for Asian carp are being developed. For some of the additional ones, the big head and silver are there, but black and grass carp, those types of assessments are important contributions for science to help the states and province decide how to deal with these risks. In terms of science coordination and transfer, the one that stands out in my mind was, I believe it was late 80s, in the Walleye Task Group, and I was on the task group at the time. The model we were using had fallen apart, and I think it was Randy Eschenroder that said, why don't we bring in Rick DeRiso from the Pacific Halibut Commission, and he'll introduce you to this thing called catch-at-age analysis. And that's the one I remember. We brought him in, technology got transferred, and it's used today. Different platform, same model. And I think the other part of this too is the issues and opportunities, the sounding board going back and forth between the managers and the commission. In my view, the earlier years, I didn't see a whole lot of use, to be honest. I didn't see a lot of use out of the advisors. When I became an agency advisor, watched this evolve over time, saw the attention, I think, that was being given through Mark Gaydon's program, particularly with the advisors. I thought it leapt up substantially in terms of significance and importance. They can say things that managers can't say. And I think it's important to have that third-party connection, a neutral facilitating group to hear them, as opposed to directly by the managers for some issues. And getting that feedback is really important. And relative to the lake committees and the managers, obviously there's always tension. There's regulation that has to happen. Solidifying objectives is the first prerequisite for that, I think. And then you look at the example of the Lake Erie Person Management Advisory Group, which is exactly doing that. And it's really nice to see that moving forward. For those that are familiar with this, there's actually a paper called Collective Impact by Kania and Kramer. And I'm going to make the pitch that really the Lake Committee structure and the Joint Strategic Plan in general meets all the 5 components that you would need to qualify as a collective impact initiative. And these initiatives the paper basically looks at long-term partnerships, diverse interests working towards a common goal in an effective way. And all successful ones that they've examined have these 5 components. So we have the common goal, and we have lake-specific objectives. We use the same currency to measure progress, perhaps not as well as we do in the reports, but the measures are there. We have working relationships. It's not just scheduled meetings here and there. There are communications that are ongoing. And we have what's called mutually reinforcing activities, which means every participant here has their own duties, but collectively they're working together through this committee system to achieve a common goal. And the stakeholders are engaged. And then lastly, we've got a backbone facilitation group. It's a huge prerequisite. So, back to my purpose, the things that we're doing well. I would argue that we've accommodated the relevant features and identified the key issues. It's time tested, it's adaptable, there's buy-in, we have a goal, We have strategies, we have a neutral facilitator, and there's a huge emphasis on networking and building relationships. In my view, it's a collective impact initiative. Challenges. I think this interesting paradox of dealing with invasive species, particularly sea lamprey, in the face of having to look at ways to improve or protect functional fish habitat is one of our major challenges moving forward, particularly with barriers. That's the epitome of it, but there could be other things as well. How that unfolds, I think, is going to be a focal point for a lot of you in the commission moving forward. Part of that involves this huge opportunity presented by the amended Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which now has annexes for invasive species and for habitats and species, among others. And you have GLRI and associated programs that deal with Great Lakes restoration. And there are players, US EPA, Environment Canada, and the Army Corps, that are not signatories, that are prominent players in these opportunities. So again, the key is how do you network with them effectively without using too many resources and not getting the results. Another one is what I call information overload syndrome. And there were times when I felt, with all the emails I was getting with the state, that my feet were off the ground. I wasn't doing anything anymore but just dangling. And I talked to a lot of people, and everybody seems to be feeling that same way. I think it's real, and I think the danger is that it becomes difficult. You have to spend time to think about what to do first and what to do next. And if you don't spend that time, it's easy to go into defense mode, turf protection or damage control. And I think those are two things that are destructive to this principle of building working relationships. And then lastly, this kind of goes along Mark's conclusions that communication is really, really important. And we're into an era now where there's webinars, teleconferencing, video conferencing, in light of decreasing budgets or commitments to send people places. It's going to be easier for people to do this. And this is okay as long as, this is there to begin with. The working relationships need to be established before you jump into this wholeheartedly. And I think it's really a matter of pushing when you should be pulling in the end. So I'm going to stop there and answer any questions.